Hi, thanks for coming. Last night around 9 o'clock and right up until midnight, the number one tweet in the world was the Central Park 5 tweet. Hashtag CP5. And if you're out there on the web tonight watching this show, please feel free to tweet your questions or your comments. We'll be looking forward to reading them later on. And we'll also be taking questions this evening from the audience here at the Times Center in New York. About 10 years ago or so, a college student came to visit me at the Times, the old Times building out here, and she was writing a paper about violence and women and media coverage and race, and she had some ideas about turning it into a book, and I was just thrilled because she was concentrating on the Central Park jogger case, which I had just spent a heck of a lot of time writing about with my colleague Kevin Flynn here at the Times. And so we sat up in the Times lunchroom for 2 hours or so talking about this, and at the end of it I said, "What are you going to do after this?" And she said, "Oh, I think I'm going to make a documentary about it." And I thought, but did not say, "Little girl, are you out of your mind?" And, but I still, it's a lot of money, a lot of time. The guys are hard to get. It's, oh my God, it's so much work. And she said, "Well, my dad's going to give me a hand." I said, "Who's your dad?" So Ken Burns is her dad. Sarah Burns is the author of the book. David McMahon, I'm not sure if he's here tonight, but David McMahon is the third maker of this film. He is also the husband of Sarah. And they have created a piece of journalism and documentary film that I think has provoked tremendous contemplation by people in New York and now around the world about what justice is. But it also tells us about the city that existed in 1989. And it's much different than the city we're all sitting in tonight. And to start off tonight's program, I'd like to look at one of the clips from the film that sets the scene in 1989. New York in the late 1980s was a completely schizophrenic, divided city. There was enormous wealth gushing into the city out of the rise of the financial industries, which had surged beginning around 1980. So the city that had been in a big collapse for several decades had turned around. But there was a whole side to the city in which drug gangsters and crack and a kind of hard, permanently locked underclass was in place, and there was enormous suffering. It was as if there was a social moat that divided these two New Yorks.
The city, when I came in, was on the edge of bankruptcy, and people thought we would not recover.
We were a city coming out of a series of crises, enormous economic crisis, a school system that was in collapse, political institutions that seemed to be failing the people and not meeting their needs, old, fashionable, beautiful, noble neighborhoods falling apart.
And of course, overriding was crime.
Several things happened to me that I just considered normal part of living in New York City. A couple of muggings and near muggings, and I didn't even report any of these things. Just kind of figured it's the way it is.
People had it worked out in their heads that their block was safe. The streets they walked to get to the subway to go to work, they were okay. Their subway line, they got on the same spot in the train every day. That was okay. They had figured out a safe path through this, garden of terrors.
And then in about 84, crack came to New York City, and that increased crime. No question about it.
When the crack wars happen, all of a sudden, teenagers have lots of cash and guns. And all hell breaks loose in Bedford-Stuyvesant. All hell breaks loose in Harlem. All hell breaks loose in Brownsville, East New York. We were supposed to be afraid. It would have been irrational not to be afraid. But the people who suffered most with the rise of criminality, gang wars, drug wars, were actually the people we blamed. Most of the homicides were young, poor, working class, black and brown kids. And the dominant social message was, no one cared if you lived or died.
As far as I'm concerned, in the late 80s in New York City, the black community was under assault. The most endangered species in America, that was a popular phrase, was the young black man.
April 19th, 1989. Yusuf Salaam. What happened that night? Where were you?
Well, April 19th, 1989 was a turning point of life, so to speak. You know, you go from hanging out with friends, thinking that you're going to, go skateboarding in the park or walk around the lake, to mayhem, so to speak, breaking out, and you kind of looking at it from the perspective of, wow, this is crazy. What's going on here?
Kevin, do you remember that night?
Yes, I do.
How did it begin for you? Where were you?
People remember that Wednesday night, it was Easter vacation. So kids, we could hang out a little later because there was no school till Monday. And at that time, I was quite good in basketball, so I was playing basketball outside, basically in Schaumburg, where I lived at. And went from, like Yusuf was explaining, went from one moment playing basketball, and then the next moment everything became a blur. And got to a point that I was living in a nightmare, but I was still awake.
Well, before it gets to a blur, you left the basketball court. Why? Who said let's do something else, or did you say let's do something else? What got you going?
I lived across the street from the park, actually, on 110th in Manhattan, upper Manhattan. And I seen a group of kids entering the park. At the time, I followed.
Mm-hmm. Did you know these guys?
I knew some from just seeing them in the neighborhood, and I knew some from school. But that night, I was a follower. I followed them into the park.
Raymond, what happened in the park?
Well, when you go into the park and you're going with a group of kids, and there's older guys, there's bigger guys, and as you walk in, police, run up on us because they see a large group of kids and a lot of kids scattered. And we spent a lot of time looking for other people. That like for me, I came in with a group, with a couple of friends that went to school with me, and I lost them. Uh-huh. So that was really spent. A lot of that time was spent looking for them in the park.
Yeah. Corey, do you remember how you ended up in the park that night?
coming out of Kennedy Fried Chicken. After all these years, 20, 23 years, 24 years, it's still there. And had a lady friend with me. And as we was on our way out, about to head upstairs, where she resided, Yusuf came my way and asked me about hanging out with her. And that was it.
Antron, do you remember violence in the park that night? Can you tell me about that?
Oh yes, I remember violence. It was just real hectic. It was crazy. Just standing there and watching somebody get beat. You know, it was just I couldn't believe it, but I stayed there. You know, watch a man get beat.
Yeah.
I stayed there, but it was unreal.
I think one of the unfortunate realities of being a child, you know, is there's a certain amount of curiosity when you see things. It's almost like moths being drawn to fire, you know. And it's interesting, like, you know, when Kevin says that it was, you know, we live right across the street. Essentially, we all thought, we who lived in Schaumburg looked at Central Park as our backyard. You know, it wasn't a crime for us to ever have gone into the park. It was like, you know, a natural thing. You know, many of us were just experiencing, trying to be romantic, you know. So for us, a romantic day would be walking around the mirror. And it's funny because back then, you think about that, and it wasn't a pleasant looking mirror at the time. You know, it was smelly and all of that stuff, but it was our mirror, you know. And, you know, when Antron is talking about this idea of seeing violence breaking out, I think that that's another reality that you face as a child. Just kind of looking at something and saying, oh, wow, what is this? Like, this is absolutely crazy. You know, a lot of people, they sometimes don't understand it from that perspective and realizing that a child can be a witness to something without being a participant in something. And then all of a sudden now, here we became known as the culprits, you know.
Right.
And that was the part that was unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, what drew you to this story?
Well, in 1989 when this happened, I was 6 years old. And so it wasn't a story that I'd followed in the news at all at that time. And I learned about it first in 2003. I was a college student, and I spent the summer working for a civil rights lawyer. I was thinking about going to law school. And this lawyer was just then getting involved in the civil suit that is still now ongoing 10 years later in this case. And that was how I learned about the case. And I was so shocked. I don't think I'd really been exposed to a story quite like this before, at least not in a contemporary setting as this. And I started looking at the media coverage and seeing this language that was used, wilding and Wolfpack, and it sort of fit with what I was studying, and it reminded me of these things I'd learned about in African American history classes about the Scottsboro Boys case. And I was just sort of shocked to see that it had happened in 1989, this kind of language being used to describe a group of teenagers. And that was sort of the beginning for me, and I wrote about that as an undergraduate, but there was so much more to the story. And that's when I started talking to you and trying to learn how something like this happens.
If that time 10 years ago, Ken Burns had come to me in the lunchroom at the Times and started asking me questions about the Central Park jogger case, I'd say, whoa, man, this is a really complicated, intense story. And he'd say, well, yeah, but Sarah Burns is my daughter, and she told me. So, Ken, your films have covered all aspects of American life, going back to our earliest days as a country, and this one is your most contemporary project. Why did you take it on?
Well, I think the preface to it is that Sarah has, as long as I've known her, which is as long as anyone has known her, has had this fierce sense of fairness. And there's something elemental about this story that you get at, that all of the 5 men here get at in the film, and that we hope that we could sort of be the amanuensis for, which is that complexity that you were talking about. This is seemingly contemporary, but as Sarah suggests, it's as old as the United States of America. It's as old as 1619, when the first slaves arrived in this country. Whenever you are pursuing as vigorously as we all have over the last 35, 40 years, American history, you inevitably come up against the same themes and questions that engage this one, of not just race, but class, of justice, of freedom, of popular culture, and all of these things. This isn't a complex story, but the Civil War is pretty complex too, and the narratives of baseball are complex, and jazz as well. But all of them inevitably, remind us back to that original thing, that we tend to judge people by the color of their skin and not the content of their character. And I think what this film tries to do is in some ways try to reboot or rebalance that with an emphasis on content of character. And as the 5 men up here show throughout the film, and at this moment, character is what it's about.
Mm-hmm. It's also about telling stories, though. And in our next clip, we're going to see how this story first came to the public and came to people around the world, really. And it was something almost out of the worst of the fairy tales, the most nightmarish stories that we tell ourselves to frighten ourselves. And I think this next clip will give us a good taste of that, and we'll see how all of the media in New York City jumped onto this thing. So, if we can get that clip rolling.
In New York City this morning, a jogger is fighting for her life after a brutal attack in Central Park.
Viciously battered and unconscious, wearing only a jogging bra, her hands tied over her mouth.
Suspects are 14 and 15-year-olds who blazed a nighttime trail of terror.
Assaulting an elderly man, attacking a male runner, hitting another person with a lead pipe. At one time, the group was running in a pack of more than 25 youths.
The victim is now in critical condition at Metropolitan Hospital.
2 skull fractures, a significant loss of blood, and advanced hypothermia.
If she lives, it's likely she'll suffer from brain damage.
8 suspects were arraigned this weekend, aged 14 to 17.
Some of the young men told police they were just out wilding.
Wilding is a word you won't find in Webster's.
Wilding. New York City police say that's new teenage slang for rampaging in wolf packs, attacking people just for the fun.
The district attorney's office says the teenagers have confessed. The spokesman said some of those confessions are on videotape.
A woman jogging in Central Park. Central Park was holy. If it had happened anyplace else other than Central Park, it would have been terrible. But it would not have been as terrible. It was, for everybody, not just me, the crime of the century.
Kevin, what is wilding?
Wilding is not a term. They actually came up with that term when we was in the precinct. I don't know who came up with it, but that's not a term that we as kids use. They took that term and just ran with it. It doesn't make sense, actually. It's ridiculous that they even took that and made it so famous that people actually thought it was a word.
Right.
Which is not, folks.
Well, one of the stories that I read at the time said that the kids who were in the cells were singing Do the Wild Thing. Does anybody remember any songs being sung back there?
That's totally false.
Totally false?
Yeah. Tone Loc is a West Coast rapper. We wouldn't sing that back
But Sarah,
You know, I think there's one, I think a maybe more likely version. I mean, the word really came from the police who said in the press conference, this is what these kids were saying. But there's this sort of disconnect there. There's some kind of mistranslation or something happening because I don't think anyone was actually saying it. It may have been sort of a misinterpretation of Wylan, like Wylan Out, which had no violent connotations. It's something you might say about just hanging out, sort of messing around. And so it's possible that someone heard that, but it's sort of a mystery, and it is amazing that it did, as Kevin said, become this label that stuck. I mean, it still sticks to this day. I think people don't know what happened in this case, and you walk down the street and you'd say, oh, we're making this film about the Central Park jogger rape and teenagers. Oh yeah, that Wilding case. I remember that. Right. I mean, that's how people, that's what they associate with the story.
But now, anywhere two people of color, men together, commit a crime, that's Wilding.
Yeah.
And it didn't apply to the white mob in Howard Beach or Bensonhurst. They weren't called Wilders. That resulted in the death of a human being of color. So it becomes the same, archetypal thing. And as you suggest, this just it was so outrageous, and as we now know, it was outrageous, and incredible in the real sense of that word. But we went with it because it appealed to all the archetypal terrors of the vulnerable white woman and the black mob, and this is Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, in a progressive northern city at the end of the 20th century.
So what we had was a fictional concept, a fictional word about real events. There were people beaten up on the reservoir very badly. There were homeless people who had their food taken from them and beer poured on their heads. There were bicyclists who had rocks thrown at them. And there was, most tragically, a 28-year-old woman who was found late that night in a ditch, almost dead. Most of the blood in her body had left her. And the police had already grabbed groups of kids who were in the park that night. And upon hearing later on that this woman was near death, with no identification on her, they decided, well, these guys were in the neighborhood, let's see. And so another story emerged. The story told in the confessions, what are called confessions, the interrogations. And over the last 24 years, we've learned a lot through the DNA era about the almost unthinkable possibility that people will say they did something that they actually didn't do. A terrible thing that they didn't do. And we wouldn't really have ever believed it. And in fact, we probably would never have believed that it was possible in this case, were it not for the emergence of DNA and a quite coherent narrative from the real perpetrator. So the next tape we're going to look at concerns those interrogations, and the next clip that we're going to look at. And I think it's one of the most fascinating elements of this. Not necessarily for you guys so fascinating, but for people stepping who are away from it. How could they say something? They did something if they didn't do it. So if we can cue up that clip, we'll have a look at the description of how the interrogations took place and how this story came out.
Hartigan sat down and he said, "Look, Ray, I know you didn't do anything wrong, but the other guys right now, they're in other precincts and they're saying that you did it."
And they're telling me, well, you're not saying nothing, but these guys put your name in it.
And I'm like, "I didn't do anything." And he's like, "Well, this is why I'm here to help you, because I know you didn't do anything. you're a good kid. You know, this isn't you. He pulls out this picture of Kevin Richardson, and he goes, you know this kid? I'm like, no, I don't know him. And he goes, you see the scratch under his eye? That came from the woman. We know he did it. He's going down.
At this point, I'm like, I don't know these guys that's there, so I'm just gonna make up something and include these guys' names.
Okay. If you're gonna do it to me, then I'm gonna do it to you.
We're looking at the people telling what happened, men in their mid-30s, but they're talking about different people altogether, aren't you? How old were you, Raymond?
I was 14 years old then.
Kevin, you?
14.
Yeah. Antron, how old were you that night? 15. 15, and Yusef, you were 16?
15.
15. Corey, you were the elder statesman.
Sure.
How old were you?
16.
But you were almost in a way, the youngest looking of the whole group.
But the handsomest.
No, I meant at the time. You were kind of a squirt. Not the fearsome character you are today. What was it like, Corey, for you to be in that interrogation? First of all, let me ask you, when folks, I hope you've seen the movie, and if you haven't, you'll get a chance to see the actual videotapes of the statements that the five gentlemen here made. Corey, you discuss a little bit in the film that you had a hearing problem since you were quite young.
Yes.
And when you were being interrogated and interviewed that night, do you recall how your hearing and your understanding of what was being said to you, how did you process that? I mean, did you really get what was going on?
Hell no.
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 What did you think what were you trying to do when you spoke with them?
I really didn't know what. My mind just felt like scrambled eggs. I really didn't know what was going on. I just wanted to get the hell home.
Yeah.
And that was about it.
There's a moment in your videotape, or maybe it's in the written statements, I don't remember, where you describe the group attacking a police van. And we know that didn't happen. Do you remember even saying that?
No.
Well, believe me, it's in the paperwork.
Oh, yeah.
So there's many versions of the evening's stories that you told that night. They had you on tape quite a bit. And Sarah, do you remember Corey's multiple statements?
Yes, there were two. Corey signed two different written statements and gave two different videotape statements, and each time they didn't make sense because the information was wrong, and the police would sort of go back and help him get the right story, or the version of the story that they wanted to hear, and would try it again. And so they kept sort of going back, hoping that this one would be the one that would be actually helpful to them in the case. And ultimately, all of these were presented at trial. And Corey, though he served the longest sentence and received the longest sentence because of his age, was actually ultimately convicted of lesser crimes, in large part because the jury saw these four wildly different statements and recognized that at least something was wrong, though they didn't have the guts to recognize that the whole thing was wrong.
The word that comes out all the time, as in their retelling of these periods, that upwards of 30 hours with these seasoned detectives doing good cop, bad cop things. Yusef is confident that they're so angry that they're going to take him to the back and kill them, is that they just want to go home. And after no lawyers and no food and no parents for most of the, going home became a real objective to just end the nightmare. And all of the cops were giving them what they thought was this out, where if you just say it's another person, we'll let you go home. But of course, by saying it was another person, it made you present and implicated you in the crime. And so it's just one of the, as you watch it, I've watched this hundreds of times, and you just develop this pit in your stomach, because if anybody out there still says, well, I would have never done this, I think as you sit with them, you're absolutely confident how it could happen. And then you also have to say, they're 14, 15, and 16 years old. And never been in trouble before, hadn't been in the system, hadn't known how to, as many of the other boys who were responsible for some of the misdemeanors and felonies that you described in other parts of the park, had the experience and knew how to not make statements, knew how to ask for a lawyer. And these guys were unfortunately the most vulnerable because they were the most innocent.
I just want to remind our audience here and also on the web that we have 2 hashtags going for this conversation. Hashtag Central Park 5 and hashtag Times Talks. So you're welcome to send in questions or comments as our conversation goes on. Antron, you knew that you had not participated in an attack on the woman. Did you know the other fellas who were accused of that well enough to be confident that they hadn't done it either? Or did it occur to you, well, maybe they did something with that woman and I just didn't see it? Did that ever cross your mind?
Well, in 1989, when I was in the room, I didn't know what was going on. I just know I didn't have nothing to do with anything. The group was large. I knew the group was large, so I didn't know who was capable of doing anything like that. So at the time, I was like, I know I didn't have nothing to do with it, but I was getting blamed for it.
Yeah.
So I didn't know these guys. I didn't even go by the name of Antron. That's how I know they didn't know me. I had a nickname. My name was Tron. Anybody who knew me as Tron. That's why I know. But it's like, well, Kevin said Antron did it. I'm like, who's Kevin? I don't even know Kevin. Kevin don't know me. You know, I didn't even go by Antron.
Yeah.
So I didn't know who did it. I just know I didn't do it. So I was just trying to get everybody back. I was just blaming whoever. You know, and that's how it went. That's how it went for me.
Raymond, did you think it was possible that a group had attacked the jogger?
I mean, I never seen that, so I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
I didn't know these guys, you know, and so when Kevin, when Detective Hardikin produced